Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest JuliaHub webinar, Building Data Visualization Apps with Dash and Julia. I'm Misha Santamon. I'm the head of marketing at JuliaHub, and I'm joined today by our presenter, Deep Gatha. Deep is JuliaHub's product director. He was a senior product manager at JFrog and has experience in product R&D, engineering, and open source program management. From here on out, I'll turn things over to you, Deep.
All right. Thank you, Misha. All right, so I'm going to share my screen and then we can get started. I've given Misha permission to interrupt me anytime in case, something isn't working with my sharing settings. I'm not going to be able to, with all the screens I'm going to have up, I'm not going to be able to field the chat questions in real time. So Misha, again, feel free to interrupt me if something's not working.
Absolutely. Let me just remind attendees, please use the Q&A interface for any questions, or if you need Deep to zoom in on any part of the screen or you can't see anything.
All right, assuming we can get started. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about how you build a dashboard web app using both Dash and Julia. There's going to be a lot to cover. If you're familiar with Julia, some of the things I cover might seem a little simple, but I know a lot of people here might be coming from a non-Julia development world. And we're definitely going to cover every single little piece of what Dash is and how the code for Dash works. So you'll see sort of at the end how we put everything together. As Misha mentioned, I'm the product director at JuliaHub, and I've been here just under a year now. I spent a good part of my career building DevOps tools, built a lot of integrations and platforms. And one thing that I'm really proud of is I spent a lot of time in the open source world. So I was both a community manager as well as actually helped the open source team get started at Indeed.com. All right. Okay, so the basic agenda for today. So we're going to talk about what Dash is, how you actually get started building your Dash app, how you launch it. Dash comes with these beautiful templates that you can copy and paste, and then they spin up an interactive dashboard quite quickly. I'm then going to actually show you how to launch this Dash app on JuliaHub itself. And during our step-by-step demo, you're going to see a few different sections. You're going to see how we load data into our Dash app. You're also going to see Dash app elements like HTML. And at the very end, we're just going to style our Dash app so it looks like an actual application and not just data on a screen. All right. So I'm going to move because there's a little bit of sound in the background. But as I move, I'm going to keep talking. So what is Dash? Dash is basically a low-code framework for building very simple interactive dashboards. This is a screenshot of a really nice financial app that the company behind Dash shows on their website. The example that we're going to build today is not going to look quite this nice, only because I didn't spend intricate time on the styling and CSS, but we're going to get to something close to this. And I'm hoping that it's enough to really get you going. Okay, so now I'm going to reshare my screen and I'm going to show you how easy it is to actually use Dash. All right, so let me bring up my little Julia terminal, and then I will reshare this in a mode where you can see both my slides as well as the terminal. There we go. All right, so again, using Dash is extremely easy. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to add the Dash package. So you're just going to type in, make this a little bit bigger, add Dash. And this is going to add the Dash package to my environment. And once that's added, I mentioned that Dash has these beautiful templates. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy this starter template here and we're going to paste it right into the REPL. Oh, and we have to go back to the regular mode in Julia. Okay, now let's paste it. And as you can see, I pasted that Dash template into the Julia REPL, and it's actually launched a app on my local environment. So I'm going to go to port 8050 localhost and refresh my screen. And you will see that literally in less than a minute, I have an interactive data visualization app up and spinning via Dash. A few things that Dash sort of comes with in terms of its templates out of the box is the ability to sort of zoom in and out of your data app. So you can use like the magnifier. You can also sort of highlight specific sections of the app. It'll zoom into there. If you double click, it'll zoom back out. And then one thing that's really useful for any industries that have to do a lot of reporting is these Dash templates actually come with an automatic way to download this plot as a PNG. So I can just hit that there. You're going to see that that plot is now downloaded to my desktop. I can then use that image in a report. All right. I want to show you one or two more Dash templates. They're going to be sort of important to the interactivity that we're going to put into the Dash app that we build. So let me go back to my code here. And on the next slide, I've got this other Dash template. What this template is going to show you is some of the interactive elements that come out of the box with Dash. So some of those elements are going to be things like sliders, buttons, of course, as well as ways that your data can actually sort of change as you're interacting with your app. So I've just pasted that template into the REPL. And now you can see in my local host, I have this interactive sort of app with drop downs and multi-selects, radio buttons. The UI isn't very good, but this is because we're just using sort of the template out of the box. But you're going to see some of these elements as we build out our custom Dash app in a few minutes. All right, the last template that I want to load for you is my template that actually shows what a callback is. So in Dash, there's this concept of callbacks. Callbacks are basically a way for users to input information and for that information to then be called back onto the page. So let's load that up and we'll see what that actually does. All right, so I'm going to put that template in there. And then going back to my local environment, you're going to see I now have an input value area. And basically, when I type in something in this input, like hello world, the output is then presented on the screen in real time. So that is what is a callback in Dash. All right, cool. Okay, so now that I've shown you a little bit of what Dash does, let's sort of start getting rolling on how the demo is going to go and what we're actually going to build. So let me just sort of present this, and there we go. Okay. So the question that you're probably asking is, these templates are really nice, great interactivity, but how do I build my own template, my own Dash app, and how do I load my data? So to do that, we're actually going to show you how to do it in JuliaHub. If you don't have a JuliaHub account, it's quite easy. You just go to JuliaHub.com, and we actually have a free version of JuliaHub for anybody to use. All you have to do is just go to JuliaHub. You can click on Start for Free. You can also click on the little person icon in the top right. It'll then take you directly to the ability to log in using an identity provider or an email. I always just click on the Gmail option. So do that. I'm going to log in with my JuliaHub account. And now I'm in JuliaHub. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over the JuliaHub in this particular, webinar, but there's a bunch of others out there that you can see. What's most important for this one is this applications area. So the application that we're going to launch is the Julia IDE experience, which spins up a browser version of Visual Studio Code. I'm going to go ahead and launch the one that I have on my internal JuliaHub team account. So going to my JuliaHub, and mine looks a little different than the free one. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to connect to the Julia IDE. Once the IDE starts, you're going to have some information here. I have my app for the demo preloaded to save time. But on the very left of the IDE, you're going to have a few things you can take a look at. You've got access to the Julia core language libraries. You have this JuliaHub icon that's going to show you what jobs you're running within this JuliaHub instance, data sets that your company has uploaded that are public for you. And there's also the ability to start up new jobs, including, changing the configuration settings. You can increase the node type and the machine configuration here. So that's all available, and not something I'm going to demo, but sort of wanted to highlight that as we're launching the IDE. Okay, coming back to the actual webinar, let's go to the next slide. So here's just something I want to show you. So if I go ahead and I take that same Dash template that we used, in my local REPL, and I put that into JuliaHub, we're going to just load that right here. What you'll see once this sort of pastes and starts getting going, is that the app server is, it's going to try to launch the app. But the problem is that this server here is not the right proxy settings for JuliaHub. So the app's not actually going to work in the Julia IDE by using the Dash default template documentation. So the first thing I want to sort of inform you as you're like doing this in JuliaHub is you need to update a few of the environment variables. So a couple updates that you're going to want to make is in the template in JuliaHub, you're going to want to make sure you have these two packages using Dash and using sockets. Sockets is actually going to help us launch this app in JuliaHub itself. So to do this, I'm just going to go into a example, example file here, and I'm going to type, I'm going to paste using Dash and using sockets. The next thing that I need to do is I need to assign a port, and this is going to be a port that specifically works within JuliaHub itself. So this port is going to be port 8888. The last thing for our sort of customization of launching this is going to be the run server command. So going back into JuliaHub, we're going to use this right here. This is going to tell our app that when it launches, it should point to the local host at port 8888. So these are just sort of the things I want you to keep in mind when you're sort of copying those Dash templates and pasting them to try to launch them. So now that we've made these updates, let's go back to that original template, and we're going to try that again. So we'll just grab this piece here. We'll paste that right to there, save it, and I am going to sort of restart the terminal session, the REPL session. And I'm going to launch this example, and you should see the Dash app. So to launch it, we're just going to include the example.jl, and hopefully in a couple seconds, you'll have that. Oh, I always forget this. One thing you definitely have to do is make sure, oh, I'm missing some code, but oops, 1 second. This is always my issue with doing this live. So I deleted something that I originally had. So I need this right here. Okay. And then one thing I always forget to do is make sure you're also, loading up these packages anytime you're launching something new. Okay, so now let's include this example.jl file. And it's simply telling me that hot reloading isn't enabled in JuliaHub. But if we go to this browser here now, you should see my Dash app. And so you're seeing the Dash app. It's got a background color because I've got some CSS already loaded in my example. But that's basically, some of the details you have to keep in mind when you're launching this within JuliaHub. All right. There may have been a question that came in. No? Okay, cool. All right, let's keep going.
Deep, just to clarify, I know as everyone is following along, we got the question, will we get a copy of the presentation? And I let everybody know that you will get a copy of the recording for the webinar. So you don't have to take super fast notes.
Yes, you're definitely gonna get a video. I know I'm moving quite fast. And we will email you, a copy of this documentation as well after the webinar. Okay, so quick spoiler alert. Before I actually walk through how to build out our Dash app, I want to show you what we're actually building. So I'm just going to launch it, and then we can, quickly glance at what we're going to build. So let me go into JuliaHub again. I already have my app built in a file called app.jl. And I'm just going to go ahead into the terminal here, and I'm going to relaunch it. So we're going to hit include, and this time we're going to launch the app.jl file. So let's give that a couple seconds. Oh, one thing it might tell me is I've got, I think I have that port already being used, so I may need to close this and redo it. Nope, we're good. Okay. All right, so let's go back to that port. And so this is the application that you're going to watch me build. It has some commodity information, the average price of certain commodities over the last 50 years. We'll talk a little bit about the data in a minute, but I just wanted to just sort of show you this is what the sort of output or the final version of this demo is going to result in. Cool. All right. All right. Next. So this demo, I've broken it into sort of 3 pieces, so it's easier to follow along. The first thing I'm going to do is talk a little bit about, data related packages in Julia, primarily data frames. Again, if you're coming from the Julia world, this is super easy, obvious stuff. But I think for some of you that are less familiar, it's important to show you step by step what's happening when you load your data. The second piece is going to be all about Dash. This is where we're going to spend the majority of our time. You're going to actually see me walk you through every single coding element and syntax of our Dash app. And then we're actually going to, take that code. We're going to sort of go line by line and type it into our environment in the JuliaHub. And at the very end, we'll launch it. I'll show you how to add the CSS so that the app, looks like a real app. I'm going to pause for 2 seconds, see if anyone has questions. So somebody's asking, what's the difference between Dash and Stipple? So Dash is a framework, as well as, Stipple. Stipple is another framework to build dashboard apps, but Stipple is from a company called Genie. It's a different framework. So they're just different frameworks to build the same thing. In this particular demo, I'm showing you Dash because Dash has these beautiful templates that are pre-made. But if you're building a dashboard app and you want to use a different framework, such as Stipple, which is part of the Genie framework, you're welcome to do that too. Now, another question is, what are some unique things that Julia presents over Python? That's not something I'm going to cover extensively today, but generally, if you've looked up anything around Julia versus Python, Julia has has a lot of speed capabilities. The code just executes much faster, and this actually results in any functions and data models and anything that you're executing through Julia. In some cases, it's 10x faster. If you add optimizations and you actually use some of our proprietary Julia packages, depending on the models you're building, we've seen information that shows that you can launch your data through a surrogate, and the output will come out like 500x faster than Python. So again, not an extensive answer, but there's a lot of information online about the differences between Julia and Python. Cool. Okay, so let's keep going. All right, so piece number one is let's talk a little bit about Julia packages for data science. The main one that I want to talk about is how to load data. So the data that we're going to load is a CSV file. This is just like a screenshot of it, but I can show it to you in JuliaHub. It has commodity prices for things like coffee, tea, barley, maize. This is a data set that I downloaded off of Kaggle. Again, when we send you out the resources, we can give you access to this data set. And the main packages that we're going to use so that I can show you how to load this data is the data frames package, as well as the CSV package. So because this data set is, file CSV, we need the REPL to be able to read data from CSV files. All right, so I'm going to do a little bit of a slideshow view. So this is basically the command we're going to use to load up our data set. I just want to break down this particular command really quickly. So df, this is actually going to be the name that we give the data frame inside our code. You can name it anything. You can call it, commodity price. You can call it X. But in a lot of demos, just as shorthand, we call it df for data frame. And then you're going to see that that data frame is going to take the csv.read functionality from the CSV package, and it's going to read the file commodity prices.csv, and it's going to take the data from that file, from that CSV file, and it's going to turn it in. Technical difficulties. Let me do this one last time. All right, we're going to just open up our Dash file in our local VS Code. This way we have all the files in there. Here I've got my data file, my CSV, and what I'm really going to do here is I'm going to show you some of that code that I was explaining on the slides. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that we've got those two packages, started up. So I'm going to say using data frames, as well as using CSV. Then we're going to grab the data from that CSV file. So I'm just going to use this. Let me see if we can just do this sort of side by side. So what we'll type is df equals csv.read. Then we're going to read from the com.prices.csv file and make sure that we turn that into a data frame. And so what you're going to see is we've now taken all that data from the CSV file. It's been loaded right into Julia, the Julia REPL. It's now a data frame. And now I can actually work with this data frame very easily. I don't have to constantly, have the Julia REPL call the data directly from the CSV. It's just loaded right here. And so the first thing that we're going to do with this data is we're going to actually create a very simple plot, and it's going to plot a time series of the data from 1971 up until 2021. That's the extent of the data set, and I'm going to just pick a particular commodity so it's easier to see what's in the plot. So to plot this, we do need to use the plots package. So I'm going to type in using plots. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign the X and Y value. So for X, we're going to grab part of the data frame that has the information for the years. So that I'm going to assign X to df.year. And you're going to see that it's now showing me all the data from that particular column. We're going to then assign Y to one specific column. So we're going to go ahead, we'll pick, we'll pick banana. And so Y is now going to grab all the data from the column that has the commodity prices for banana. And now that we've assigned those variables, we can plot X and Y. Okay, and you're going to see that we've got this very simple plot here. This is showing me the growth in the average price of bananas over the course of the last 50 years. If you do want to sort of plot everything, one way to do that is actually, turn your data frame into a matrix. Let me show you how to do that really quickly. So instead of assigning Y to, one particular column in our data frame, what we can do is we can use the matrix functionality, and we are going to then grab, I'm actually just going to copy and paste it. It's easier that way for me. And so what we're doing is we're now assigning Y to a matrix of data frame. It's going to grab all the commodities. There's 31, columns. So it'll grab all 31 columns, and then it's going to plot those. Let me just see what's going on with this. Okay. Let's grab this one more time. There we go. All right. So now that we've got that matrix in there, we will replot this, and you're going to see all the information has been plotted into based on the matrix of information in the data frame. Cool. All righty, let's move on. Okay. So as you can see, this plot is extensive, but it's not very useful visually the way it is. So just in the interest of this particular demo, I'm not going to use every single commodity. We're just going to grab 4 that I really like. So those 4 are going to be the columns in our data frame for coffee, the prices for coffee, for cocoa, for sugar, and for tea. And I will quickly plot that, including the labels, so you can see sort of the data that we're going to be working with. So hopefully this will work on one try this time. So going back into the REPL, we're going to just plot the information from the data frame for those 4 commodities. And there you go. It's come out quite nice. So now you're seeing the prices for cocoa, coffee, tea, and sugar from 1971 to 2021. So this is the data that we're going to be using for the rest of the demo. Cool. So I'm going to pause for a second. I'm just going to see if there's any quick questions in. Let's see. Okay. So one question is it required on JuliaHub to use Dash with Julia, or can I use my own Sublime, my own text editor like Sublime Text? So when you start JuliaHub, we have a number of preloaded sort of application environments. One of them is the Julia IDE, which is you can see is Visual Studio Code. We don't have Sublime Text loaded into JuliaHub. I don't know if those are things we're going to support. So really the answer is, we expect you to use the Julia IDE for most of your development. If you're an enterprise customer, we can, load other applications into JuliaHub. But in general, the Julia IDE is the place to go. Another question is, does Maki.jl also work for plotting with Dash? I believe it does. There's some elements when we build our Dash app, you're going to see that are pretty custom to how Dash calls data into the into the browser. I haven't specifically tested if every graph and plot functionality in Maki will load in the browser using the Dash templates. That's something I have to investigate. Most of the other questions are about comparing Julia to other languages. Maybe we can touch a little bit more on those questions at the end, but I'm not going to touch on them now. Okay. So coming back to the demo, so I showed you basically how to plot your data, including, create a matrix of all the elements. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to sort of step 2 of this presentation, and we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what it means to build the Dash app. So I'm going to go ahead and just share my whole desktop again. This just makes it easier as we sort of switch back and forth between JuliaHub and the slides. Okay, so as we talk about building a data app, some of the things that I'm going to show you is, again, I showed you how to launch the template in the Julia IDE. I showed you how to turn your CSV file into a data frame. You're going to see this again as we're pasting our code into the Julia IDE. I showed you how to select specific columns from the data frame and plot those. And as you watch, and learn how the Dash app works, you're going to see how we use callbacks to then call that data from the data frame and then call that into the browser itself. And at the very end, you're going to see some basics around CSS and style sheets. Okay, so the next few slides are going to have all the code we're using. I pasted it sort of slide by slide, and I want to talk through it. This code is going to primarily go in this order. So we're going to load the Julia packages. We're then going to talk about the data layer, which is the data frame and the CSV package that then reads my data from the CSV file and turns it into the data frame element. We will then talk about how Dash views HTML. So this is pretty straightforward once you're using it. If you're familiar with HTML, you're going to recognize this code pretty much right away. Then we'll talk about callbacks again and styles. Okay. So first thing that we want to do anytime we are, building any app is we want to make sure we're loading those packages. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to bring up my JuliaHub screen and have the slide deck sort of sitting together. I have an empty file called dev.jl where we're going to do some of our coding. So the first thing again is you're going to want to make sure that you have the right packages loaded. So the first piece of our code that's important is this piece right here. We are going to load these 4 packages. So we're going to use Dash, CSV, data frames, and sockets. Sockets helps us launch the app in JuliaHub itself. The next thing to keep in mind as we're coding is, again, these specific elements that are going to make sure that we can launch this app on the right port, port 8888. We're then going to grab the code that helps tell Dash this is an app in this file. And at the very end of the file, we're going to want to make sure that we have the run server syntax in there. So this is basically how we get started with our template that we're coding right now. And as you sort of follow along on this video moving forward, just sort of make sure that you've got all these elements in place. If you're trying to use a Dash template out of the box, again, it's not going to work unless you have these small customizations. All right, so let's build our app. So the next thing is I'm going to grab some of the data elements. So something, I had already shown you is turning the com prices CSV into our data frame. So that's what this code does right there. The next thing that's really important for our Dash app is building a dictionary that grabs the commodity prices from the columns that I indicated. So when I build this dictionary, I'm going to give it a name, and for this demo, we're calling it all options. And this dictionary actually is going to have some keys. You can type in the keys directly. So if you want to use coffee, the column for coffee, the column for cocoa, you can do that. Just to be a little more sort of, use best practices, what I actually want to do is I'm going to grab specific columns using names functionality. And just because I've done this demo, I know that the column for, cocoa is in space 2. So I'm going to grab 2. I'm then going to make sure that it pulls in all the information from pricing for that column. And I'm just going to repeat this code 4 times for my 4 commodities. Just keeping in mind that the columns that we're going to grab the data from is 2, 3, 4, and then sugar is actually in column 8. So that is the updates I'm making here right now. Okay. All right, so now that we've got the dictionary written up, we can move on. These are the Dash HTML elements. So as we build our Dash app, and you want this information to render in your browser, you're going to use HTML, and Dash has sort of preset HTML elements that you can put on the page. There's a lot of tooling behind the scenes that sort of makes this very easy for your browser to understand. But the main ones are the app.layout that points to your main sort of div container for the entire presentation of your app. And some of the other elements you're going to see on this page are going to be your divs. So HTML_div, your H tags, so H1 through H6. You're going to see P tags. You're going to see some buttons as we do this. And you can use other HTML elements as well, such as breaks and HRs to create like lines in the display of your app. When we actually get to coding this, we're not going to use all 5 elements in order. I will show you during the coding, like which ones we're using, and you'll see it when we, launch it in the browser. The most important part of Dash, I think, is learning how the callbacks work. So what I'm showing you here is essentially the syntax. You're going to type in callback, and in the callback, you're going to have an input and you're going to have an output. And once you've labeled your input and your output, you're going to then tell this particular callback what the result is going to be. So any results that you want from the callback, like you want data to load on the page, that's what you're going to put in the sort of do return end area right here. So the way this actually looks in real life, you have the callback, you have the ID of the callback. So in this example, for the output, the ID is prices, which is our price information. It's going to grab all the options from our dictionary. So that's the property value. The input, the ID is commodities. Since I'm loading, my 4 commodities, that's the ID for the input. And the actual property for the input is going to be the value that I'm loading from the dictionary for those commodities. Again, we're going to do this live. This is just sort of pre-learning, so you know what I'm doing when I'm actually typing it in. And then I mentioned that you always want the callback to do something. So in this example, it's going to actually return every option that is in my dictionary for the commodities. So as you saw when I wrote my dictionary, I pointed to columns 2, 3, 4, and 8. So this callback is actually going to go to that dictionary. It's going to pull in all those options And you're going to see when we build the app, it's going to populate those options in a drop down. And so this is essentially what the result of that callback is. Okay. Now there's two special elements that we're going to build into our Dash app. These elements in the Dash code always start with DCC underscore. So the two elements that we're going to use is a graph element. This is actually going to allow your data to, basically be presented as a plot inside your browser. The other element we're going to use is the drop-down element so that we can select different things on the screen. Dash comes with a bunch of different elements, as you saw in the earlier templates I posted. There's sliders, there's multi-select, but for this demo, we're just going to stick to these two. Okay, so let's actually do some live coding. And again, bear with me. If I mess up, I will fix it. And I appreciate you guys sort of being patient with this presentation. Okay, so let's do some coding. So I'm going to sort of have both of these screens up. So here I've got my dev.jl file. This is where I'm going to sort of live code. We've already done these first few steps. So we've made sure to, use the right packages. We've added the port elements that I mentioned are going to launch this actual app on JuliaHub. And we've added the data layer elements. So we've got the csv.read of our com prices CSV, and we've created our dictionary. Okay, so if we go and we look at the Dash app that I had earlier, I'm going to relaunch it just so we can take a look. Sorry, I have a lot of screens up right now. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I'm going to just relaunch this really quick just so we can take a look. So we're going to do include app.jl. And the first thing we're going to build as we're going through the live code is going to be the first few elements on the screen. So that's going to be things like the div element, the first graph that's going to graph all the commodities, as well as some of the text. So there we go. It is now opening. So we're going to start with making sure we've got the H1 tags, that we've got a little bit of text here just to, so there we go. It is now opening. So we're going to start with making sure we've got the H1 tags, that we've got a little bit of text here just to, explain what this visualization dashboard does. I used some button elements to sort of, explain that this app is going to focus on these 4 commodities. So let's go ahead and let's just build this top piece. So going back into the code, we're going to then grab each of these elements. So the first one is we're going to start with our H1 tag. And this is going to be the place where we have the title of the app that shows up. So I'm going to type in HTML underscore H1, and we're just going to say world prices app. And as you know, if you've used Visual Studio Code, as I type this, it gives me auto suggestions to fill in sort of the information. So you can ignore those, but they're going to pop up on the screen. Next, after H1, we're just going to have a P tag, and this is just going to say, this application shows you data from around the world concerning, world prices for each commodity listed from 1971 to 2021. Okay. Next, we're just going to add my buttons. So HTML underscore button. I'm going to call this first one coffee. And I'm going to give each button ID. This is just a way to identify these buttons later. These first few buttons are not actually going to do anything. These are just style elements for this demo, but you'll see later we're going to add a few more buttons that will be interactive. So I'm just going to give these really basic IDs, button 1, button 2, and that way we can move on. Coco ID button 3. And the last one is going to be our commodity sugar, and that is going to have the ID of button 4. All right, the last sort of HTML element for now is going to be an H5 tag. So best practices when you're building a web app, you know, for SEO purposes, you want to make sure you actually go in a hierarchy H1 through H6. We're going to ignore that because this is a demo. So we're just going to go and label this information with an H5. This is just going to make sure that the font size looks really small in our app. It's just a styling consideration. So that is what I'm doing here. Right. All right, so those are sort of the elements that are going to be at the top of our Dash app. The next two things I just want to put in there is some breakpoints or some breaks. These are just going to add extra space between the style elements at the top and then what we're going to add later. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure I save that. Okay. All right, let's go to the next step. So the main layout of this Dash app, it's going to have two blocks. It's going to have a block that sits to the left and a block that sits to the right. We're going to start with just sort of the left side block. I might end up just copying some of this directly in, but we're going to create a div and we're going to give that an ID of left. And once I give it this ID, in my CSS, which you're going to see later on, I'm going to grab that div element by the ID left, and I'm going to, in the CSS, make sure that this ID is given a style of block, and that we float it to the left. You're going to see that in the CSS section, but I'm just making sure you understand that, you know, we're grabbing the ID of left, and that's how this style is going to be put into place. Okay, so this div is going to have a couple children elements, and I'm just going to copy this so I don't have to type it all out. And the elements that we're going to put into the div is going to be a few things. It's going to be a H3 that says commodity. Oh, I copied the wrong thing. Yeah, commodity app. It's going to be an H5, which has some lorem ipsum, some text. It's then going to also have a drop down. So I mentioned earlier that we've got some drop down information. This is just highlighting because I have some extra code that I copied. And okay, children. Oh, that was a problem. Okay. So the children elements in this div are an H3 and H5. And then I mentioned earlier this dropdown element that Dash provides, DCC underscore dropdown. So this dropdown is actually going to select the commodity options in my dictionary. So what the dropdown is actually doing is I've given it an ID and a starter value. And then the options for the dropdown are going to be every element in the keys of the dictionary. So when we load this app, you're going to see that that particular dropdown then goes into my dictionary and grabs every individual element. In my dictionary, we have 4 elements. Again, it's the 4 commodities, coffee, cocoa, tea, and sugar. All right, so we've got the dropdown and we've got the div for my elements on the left. All right, cool. Next step. Okay, so callbacks. So this is, again, what I really want you to focus on when you start building your Dash app. This is probably the part that might be the most confusing. A lot of sort of mistakes around functionality happen in the callback area. So let's sort of try to sort of type this in one by one, and I'll try to break it apart as we go. Okay. So first thing is you're going to type in callback, and in the callback, this is going to be, you know, part of your app. It's then going to have an output, and the output, again, ID is going to be prices, and this is going to basically grab the price list from my data frame. From that price list, it's going to give me every option in this particular callback. The input is going to be my commodities. And the information we want from the commodities is the values. And the thing that I want this particular callback to do is I want to select all the values in the commodity list. This is the callback that's actually going to populate the dropdown that I mentioned earlier. So it'll return, we're going to label these. It's going to return every element in my all options dictionary around selected commodities. Okay. And I just want to make sure that I ended this block. So, and we don't need that. Okay. So let's just sort of make sure that we label this, comment this. So we've got a callback right there. And this callback, what you're going to see is it is going to affect our drop down for commodities here. So this is an ID, and you can see the output of this callback matches this ID. The DCC dropdown, again, this is an element that's going to render on the page based on the functionality happening in this callback. All right, let's go to the next one. All right, the next callback is then going to populate all the prices. So we'll make sure that we comment this. So we've got a callback for commodity information, and then we've got a callback for our prices. Again, we're going to do callback. We're going to make sure it speaks to this app. We're then going to start with the output. And the output here, the ID is prices. And this is going to output all the values of the prices. The input here is actually going to also be my price list, but this is the input is going to be the options. So you'll see how that works in the actual dropdown once it populates. And what we want this particular callback to do is we're going to allow it to grab all the available options in the price list. And this is populated from that dictionary that we created earlier. And it's going to return. Oh, I'm missing. There we go. It's going to return those available options. Okay, and again, we want to make sure that ends. And there we go. We have 2 callbacks written in our dev.jl file. All right, we're about halfway there. So the next part of the code I'm going to show you is the very last callback for now. So this is the callback that actually is going to display all the information in another block on the page, the right side of the block. So let's just go ahead and write this one out. So this is going to display information in the right side of my dashboard right here. So we're just going to type in callback, and we're going to talk to the app. We're going to give an output. So this output is actually just a label that I'm calling display selected values. It's just a standard output ID that Dash usually has in a lot of its templates. So this output is going to grab all the children elements that we are putting into the callback. The input, it's actually going to take two inputs. The first is going to be the input from our commodities callback, which you can see right above. It's going to grab the values there. And the other input, again, is going to be prices. And this time it's just going to grab the value of the prices. And what do we want this callback to do? It's going to select, it's going to store this information when it loads it on screen in these two variables called select commodity and select price. And it's going to return some text, and this text is actually going to take the information in those variables and it'll display that text on the screen. And then we're going to end this. Okay. So as you can see, we've created 3 callbacks. This is basically loading up all the functionality in the Dash app. What we need to do to sort of finish this off is code in the last elements on the page. And that last element is going to be our right side div. So if you scroll back up, you've got your information here, HTML. And one thing that I need to make sure I do is grab the app layout. So the HTML needs to render in a layout. So the app.layout is where that HTML is going to actually render. And I forgot to write that in, so I'm just going to do that now. Okay. And at the end of that layout call, you also want to make sure that you end it. So we have that there. Okay. All right, so going over what's going to display on the page, you've got sort of your H1 tag, your P tag, you've got some buttons. You have this div that's going to create an element on the left side. And now we're going to finish this off by adding one more big div element. This div element is actually going to create elements on the right side of the app. So to do that, we're just going to open a new HTML div, and we're going to give it an ID of right. Okay. And then we're going to make sure that this div also has some children elements. And the children for this one are going to be, oops. The children are going to be a div that outputs the selected values from the callback. So this first div is actually going to display anything that I put in this output, this return area for the callback called display selected values. So you're seeing that right there. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add my 4 buttons. So these 4 buttons are going to actually create functionality that calls back graphical elements on the page. So those buttons are a button for coffee, for cocoa, for tea, for sugar. Notice that the IDs here actually are different from the buttons I pasted above. So these buttons have IDs that are actually going to be called onto the page. So this one says show coffee, show cocoa. You'll see how that works when we build our very, very last set of callbacks. After the buttons, I'm going to create the DCC dropdown element. This will create an actual dropdown that we can select from. And this dropdown is going to have an ID of price. And this is actually going to, again, load information from the callback down here that grabs the price information from my dictionary. Okay. Next, just as a styling element, we're just going to make sure that there's some space between the buttons and the graphs that load. And so this last part that I want to show you is how to get the actual the graphs, the plots onto the page. So what we're going to do is we're going to put these in divs. So for each div, we're going to give an ID, and this ID corresponds to the callback ID. So I'm going to build this out step by step. So this first one is going to be called body of our coffee callback. And as you can see, as I pasted that, what you might notice if you're pretty familiar with Dash is I don't currently have a callback that outputs an ID of body coffee. So I need to build it. And so we're going to build that right now. So coming back down to where our callbacks are, oh, I did something wrong. Let's see. Try this one more time. Okay, cool. All right, so coming back to our callback section, we're now going to create one more callback. So this callback is actually going to display a plot, and this plot is going to grab information from the coffee column in my data frame. And when this column executes, when you click on the coffee button, it'll actually show you the body of that callback, which I've labeled coffee. So we'll write. Okay, cool. All right, so coming back to our callback section, we're now going to create one more callback. So this callback is actually going to display a plot, and this plot is going to grab information from the coffee column in my data frame. And when this column executes, when you click on the coffee button, it'll actually show you the body of that callback, which I've labeled coffee. So we'll write this out. I'm actually going to probably do this for all of my elements so that you can see the graphs for all of them. So this actual code is a little bit more complicated. What we're saying here is we're going to have a callback that talks to our app, and the output is going to be the body of our coffee element, so that's going to be the ID, and then the actual property will be the children of this callback. The input is going to be showing the coffee graph, which we're going to code in here in a second. So one thing this callback is going to do is it's going to track the number of clicks on the actual button that loads the graph. And if there's no clicks, it's not going to load the graph when the page renders on start. This is just an element that makes sure that these buttons don't just automatically call the elements on the page without you clicking on the button. So I just want to make sure that that is written in there. And if it does, try to render that element without me clicking on the button, it'll prevent the update from happening. Okay. So that's what that code is right there. And then the next piece is returning the actual graph that has my coffee information. So we're going to type in return cc graph, and the ID is going to be my example graph for coffee. We're then going to have the figure load, and the figure that we're going to load in is going to be all the data from the coffee column. So that data is going to be mapped as the x-axis, grabbing information from the year from my data frame, the Y column grabbing information from the Cocoa element of the data frame. And we're going to call this type plot, and name equals copy. Okay. All right, so this is now going to create a plot once that callback actually happens. And then the last things here, I just want to give it a layout name, title for copy. All right, and I just need to make sure I've got everything sort of buttoned up here. Okay, and this is telling me something's off in my end. Okay, great. All right, so that is basically the majority of the code for this app. I'm going to go ahead and save that and launch it and make sure it works. So let's go ahead and actually launch all the code that we just wrote here. So we're going to get the REPL back started, and we're going to make sure that we have included this dev.jl. And hopefully everything that I just coded live is going to spin up and show you a real app. All the elements that I coded on the page, but it's not going to have any of the styles. So let me show you what that actually looks like. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to launch our app, app.jl. And as that's getting started, you're going to actually see all of these elements have rendered on the page. It has all the interactivity, but it doesn't have any of the style elements that I showed you when I sort of showed you the final app. So to add those style elements, what we need to do is add a folder within the Dash environment called assets. And under assets, we are going to create a style sheet called style.css. So to show you again what this looks like without the styles, it's going to end up looking like this. World Prices app, got my buttons and my interactive data, and some drop down information here. But that's not very good, right? So we want to add an actual folder called assets. So I'm going to do that now. And in the assets folder, I'm going to then add a style sheet that I'm going to call style.css. On this style sheet, I'm going to add a few style elements. And because we're low on time, I'm just going to copy and paste most of this in there. But going through the slides, the first one is going to be style for background, sorry, for the body. And the body is going to make sure that the background color is this sort of dark charcoal, make sure the text is white, and that we've got some margins on our app. Next, we're going to grab the styling for those two blocks that we put in. So one of the div IDs was left, the other div ID was right. And so those are the things we're styling right there. Next, we're going to grab some styling for our H1 tags. This primarily just makes the font sizes the way I want them. And then we've got some styling for the buttons. And so I'm just pasting all the CSS styles directly into the style sheet. And then these are a few other things that I've sort of styled. This is grabbing the select control class, which affects our dropdowns. So this changes how the dropdown looks and function, how the dropdown looks. And then the other one is, we did the button already. The last one, oh, that's it. Okay, so I'm going to save my style sheet, and then I'm going to launch this app one more time. And at this point, we will have everything that we need for my demo app here. And then I'll sort of go into final thoughts and questions. So, oops. So now that we've added the style sheet, if we include app.jl, this will launch the exact same app with my style.css, which is in my assets folder. And now it's all within JuliaHub. So as that starts up, I will start taking some questions. Oh, there we go. So we've got the app, it hasn't fully started, but you see that when you add the style sheets, it actually already has some of them in there. So what is happening here? Let's check. I may have deleted a comma as I was talking. So let's just make sure that I fix that. Okay, cool. All right, so we have our final app. We've got all the styles in there. And we've got functionality. So when I click on a drop-down element, coffee, tea, I actually get the price information right there. And then if I, use this drop-down, I can actually scroll through pricing. And then when I click on one of these buttons, I can actually render the graph with the pricing for that particular commodity. Cool. So this concludes my demo. There's a fix that. Okay, cool. All right, so we have our final app. We've got all the styles in there. And we've got functionality. So when I click on a drop-down element, coffee, tea, I actually get the price information right there. And then if I use this drop down, I can actually scroll through pricing. And then when I click on one of these buttons, I can actually render the graph with the pricing for that particular commodity. Cool. So this concludes my demo. There's a few things that I had to sort of redo from scratch. So that's just the issue with live coding this much. But I will send out the resources that I showed you here. So you'll get a copy of the deck. You'll also get a copy of the CSV file and the code. And so you can load this up in JuliaHub yourself, and you'll have an app that looks just like this. All right, awesome.
Excellent. Deep. I know we do have a lot of questions. A lot of them we're following up on some comparison speed issues and other things. And I think, we can follow up with folks individually for those questions. Okay. I did have one I wanted to put out there. It was, can I load data from my model files directly into graphs in Dash?
So if you're creating model outputs in your Julia code, you can load a lot of that data directly into a DCC graph. You have to use some other elements that come with Dash, like canvases, to get certain model data to show up in your browser. So it's not something I showed today, but that generally is possible. Yeah.
Okay. Just given how over time we are, I think if you're good with it, I say we do some just direct follow-up with folks who put questions out here. And as always, you can contact me at via the email where you got the registration for the webinar, or reply to the follow-up, and I can put you in touch with people who can answer additional questions like you shared on the webinar. So I thank everybody for attending. Thank you, Deep.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And we'll definitely share these resources with you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, folks.